Hi, everybody. Welcome to ESI Digital. My name is Annie Pei. I'm a producer for CNBC and for the FTW with the Mod podcast. I'm based in New York. It's sunny outside today. It's beautiful, but you literally can't tell because I live in a dingy New York apartment, as typical. But somebody with a better view, longtime veteran of esports, you know him as the co-founder of MLG, Major League Gaming. You know him as one of the architects of the Overwatch League. And now he's got his own venture, and it's called Vindex. So my next guest needs no introduction. It's Mike Sepso. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Annie. Nice to see you.
Great, great. So, we've spent this entire week, right, at ESI, really talking to a lot of the movers and shakers in the industry, right? We've talked everything from, the evolution of advertising and sponsorships in esports, right, to, infrastructure building, but it all came from, a lot of key figures like you who have kind of laid the path down before. So, kind of based on where we are now, I would love you to tell me a little bit more about Vindex for our audience members that aren't super familiar with it, and just kind of a little more of what you're up to, in your post MLG and post Blizzard days.
Sure. Yeah. Um, well, I started in esports. I think a decade before anybody said the word esports in 2002. So I have a pretty long, I guess, point of view on how the industry's developed. And I spent a long time building MLG alongside lots of the other people that were there back then with me. And one of the big key issues with esports and in those days was there was such a separation between tournament operators and leagues and team organizations and the actual publishers and studios who own the games. So one of the things I wanted to solve when I was at Activision Blizzard was how do we kind of create a real publisher-controlled league system that also had meaningful participation from the team organizations. Therefore, you could get a permanent league that would last forever, and that was kind of what I think is certainly not my genius, but the genius behind the structure of the franchise system that Activision Blizzard has, and similar to what Riot uses. From there, it seemed to me that the sort of big structural issues that were largely holding back esports from becoming a mature business. Certainly lots of esports content was out there, and there were a lot of esports fans and players, but it wasn't really a business. That kind of created the right structure for the pro leagues, right? There was a way to invest hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions over time into these kind of structures that would monetize appropriately over time and kind of mature and create the right stakeholder relationships between team, league, and publisher. But that sort of, in my mind, left all of the other things wide open. So if you think about it, the way typical traditional sports develop over time is they kind of start with fans and players, and then it slowly organizes, and then the last thing to happen is a professional league. In this case, esports had its sort of long grassroots era and then went straight to professional. And so there's this big open gap in the middle where usually over time an entire business value chain gets created and matures, and that's everything from advertisers and media platforms to commercial relationships around things like apparel and stuff like that, like the last panelists were talking about. So a lot of that infrastructure doesn't really exist because it went from grassroots to pro and didn't have time to develop. And I thought, one of the roles that I could play, and a lot of my friends and colleagues that helped build MLG and worked at Activision Blizzard with me, and just other people from the industry and parallel industries, if we could put together a great team that really understood the ins and outs of esports and all the nuance that there is within our funky world, and then match that with access to lots of capital and really good financial operators and business operators, that we could tackle a lot of the operationally complex and capital intensive issues that are out there that are continuing to, I think, hold the industry back from truly maturing and getting up to the level of other pro sports and pro media. So from that perspective, we looked at three big areas for Vindex to go after. One was, how do we help publishers build and operate leagues and create all the content around it? Because the traditional sports and media companies that do that kind of stuff just aren't suited for it. They don't really understand it. And frankly, there just weren't any endemic players in the esports space, whether it was production of events or design of leagues or any of those kind of things, that were truly kind of global and enterprise class businesses that big public companies like EA or Activision or others would want to work with on a big scale, on a long-term scale. So that was one area that we thought we could help fix. The other was all the amateur systems. There's, lots of ways for players to get involved with esports, but it's really, right now the path to pro is sort of like you're sitting in your bedroom playing with teammates online, and then your next step is a team drafts you and you're at Madison Square Garden. Like there's no in between, right? And none of that's really been organized well. And frankly, the experience of esports really is still isolated to major cities. It's in places like LA, sometimes New York, and then sort of somewhat random places like Katowice and stuff like that, where there's ongoing big events that have become great there. But the reality is it's not in the rest of the world. It's not in hometowns across Europe and North America. And how do you kind of bring that experience to people? So that was another big area that we thought we could take on. And then finally, as you noted earlier, I've been selling sponsorship and media rights in esports since the early 2000s. It's never, ever been easy. It's always a struggle. It's always very kind of, it's kind of the most old-fashioned part of the business. You literally have to get on a plane and take a whole team of people, a bunch of PowerPoint decks, and convince them of something. Whereas in the traditional sports world, ESPN does a media rights deal to acquire Monday Night Football from the NFL, and the ad money just pours in. It's a very sort of mature ecosystem. But a lot of the reason for that is because there's a tremendous amount of transparency in data. So the advertisers understand exactly what they're buying. And so that was just another big area that we thought of as really interesting for us to look at. So we started Vindex with the first one, which is how do we sort of put together some of the best strategists, technologists, league operators, content creators from the esports world and build a big global enterprise class solutions provider for publishers to work with if they want to produce pro esports content or create leagues and operate them, things like that. And so we started Vindex last fall. We raised $80 million and we acquired a company called NGE in Burbank, who were the company that produced last year's Fortnite World Cup and continue to produce big things like Twitch Rivals and things like that. They have an amazing studio infrastructure facility that's all built for live streaming and esports, purpose-built, which I think is the first one of its size. I mean, it rivals television soundstage studios in LA. And then we were also lucky enough to help Adam Apicella, one of the three amigos from MLG, really start up Esports Engine from scratch and take with him the core team that was the MLG league operations and production team out of Activision. So that was the foundation of Vindex that we launched last October. And then since then,
No, sorry. So I was going to move on to, so like you mentioned, right? It seems like you guys are in phase two, right, of sort of this like three-pronged sort of plan, with your recent acquisition of Belong Gaming Arenas. And, obviously that acquisition's happening during a really, really interesting time, right? Much of the world is still on lockdown, shut down, and, here you are acquiring, gaming arenas, right? And so, just kind of, I would love to know, just in terms of growing a venture like Vindex, right? An esports venture like Vindex during COVID, right? Like we've heard all the stories of, streaming numbers are up, right? Revenue for, game publishers are up, et cetera, et cetera. But what are actually the biggest challenges, right, of trying to get a lot of these acquisitions and a lot of these ventures, through? You talk a lot about, hey, closing these gaps, right? And like breaking down barriers and closing the gaps and, really trying to mitigate for a lot of the challenges that might be on the way. What are the challenges that have stayed and like what are the other barriers that have kind of like come up, right? That you're now trying to find a way to bridge?
Yeah. Well, the Belong acquisition is something I've been dreaming to be able to do for a long time. So all the way back in, I think it was 2007, I was actually talking to the GameStop CEO about, how to take the Asian PC bang model and try to Westernize it and create what I consider to be kind of the necessary infrastructure for esports to really take off in the Western hemisphere. It has to be different. It's not the same value proposition for the end consumer, but Nobody really did that. Nobody tackled it in any meaningful way until Game, the retailer in the UK and Spain, about 4.5 years ago, started to experiment, and they, I think, just got it exactly right. It took years of perfecting the model, but if anyone's in the audience is in the UK and you've been to a Belong Arena, you know what I'm talking about. There's a great level of infrastructure that's suited for the very casual gamer, just to kind of have a fun social gaming experience. But it is also incredibly, in many ways, perfectly suited to provide local infrastructure to aspirational esports players and a global network capability to tie that all together, and then to what the pro leagues are doing. So that's the thesis behind it. The other incredibly attractive part about that acquisition for me and for us at Vindex was Martin Gibbs, the CEO of Game, the retailer, came with the acquisition. So he's no longer the CEO of Game. He's now the CEO of Belong Gaming Arenas, which is a Vindex company. Martin's been in the business for over 25 years. He's one of the most important people on the commercial side of the core business of gaming. So he's bringing a ton of expertise, but also his innovative capability to develop something like Belong. So that was all great. Obviously, two major roadblocks there. One, in the middle of that acquisition, COVID hit, and we were no longer able to travel.
Right.
And then obviously, retail largely got shut down in the developed world. So from that perspective, we had to, create a lot of complications. One is it's very difficult to do a transatlantic acquisition over Zoom. But we're all getting through it. We're doing, instead of a live conference, we're doing things like this. So it can happen. That's basically what we did. So it took quite a bit longer, but it wound up being a great deal. And then obviously now, we have a couple of dozen locations in the UK that are now open. So there's people in those locations now. But we have we have to take a much more thoughtful and measured approach in how we roll out across the US, because the US is not in the same, unfortunately, we're not handling the pandemic as well as our friends in Europe are, and we're certainly in the UK. So that's the challenge today, is looking at that, what's the rollout plan? But we're moving ahead and hopeful that, one, we have a model, we know how to open these locations safely, even in a COVID environment. However, we want to be, very thoughtful and keep safety as our number one priority.
Right. And so, given what you've said, right, as you're trying to roll out the rest of your business and you're really looking to North America, right, I would say that, especially here in the US, right, there is just so much more uncertainty, right, surrounding what the next year is going to look like, right? Oh, what even the next year and a half is going to look like, right? Given just kind of the government response, right, to the pandemic that's been going on here. So when you're sort of thinking about a timeline, right, and really moving forward with this phase two, of your esports ventures plan, right, how does that groundwork in the US differ, right, from the groundwork that you've laid out, say, with Belong Gaming in the UK, right? How does that? What are the differences there?
So there's great advantages and disadvantages to doing businesses like this in the U.S. One, the advantage is it's an enormous population geography. It's a very wealthy country, so the consumer base is, as compared to the rest of the world, very wealthy. The hard part is the political environment can be either really beneficial or really awful. And across the board, I think we're dealing with not just a pandemic here, but a lot of social unrest, primarily due to the political climate. So it is what it is. We have to, march on and continue to do business. I think I'm very proud of our Esports Engine and NGE groups, who, right in the beginning of March, when things started to get locked down, were able to really quickly leverage our pretty substantial technical infrastructure to create the capability to do remote broadcasting. So we went from, having multiple big offices and close to 200 employees in studios and within offices, doing broadcasts, to having to do all of that from home like this. But we were able, within just a few weeks, to turn that around and produce gigantic events like Twitch's Stream Aid. So from that perspective, I think, the gaming and esports world, and certainly the Vindex companies, are very adaptable to lots of different climates. social, political, and business, as is esports. So I think esports was able, because of those things, to be able to recover quickly. We can play games online. It's not the greatest thing. It's not perfect. Obviously, everyone would rather be in a big arena and have lots of people together. But esports and gaming are adaptable, and so we have to continue to innovate and create opportunities for gamers to game and for people to create communities, whether that's online or in person. I think the interesting thing about the Belong model is that rather than having thousands of people travel in from all over the world to one place, which is kind of the opposite of what you'd want to do in a pandemic environment, what we're talking about doing is bringing that level of infrastructure to locations, right, to hometowns. Meaning, if you want to go to a Belong to experience esports and play with your friends or play with a team, you can do that in a local place. It's a short drive from where you live. There's only people from around where you live there, and you're doing it in a socially distanced, safe environment. So I think we have a really interesting kind of short-term capability to provide people with a new experience, even under the new normal. But of course, we all hope that won't last forever.
Right. And so to kind of go back to your point about, adaptability, right? Because it's true, obviously COVID hit, right? And esports was able to pivot really quickly, right? Um,
Yeah.
But then I feel like there are certain sectors, right, within the industry, right, that have, sort of been left like struggling a little bit, right? Honestly, you even still look at a lot of like retail, right? Obviously that can't, a lot of that just couldn't happen, right? Under COVID. And so in your opinion, and I'm kind of broadening this out to the esports industry as a whole now, in your, from your perspective, what are some of the sectors of the esports industry, right, that even regardless of COVID, regardless of the fact that we're in a pandemic, just have actually adapted and grown slower than you would have expected over the years, and why?
Well, I mean, the things that have adapted quickly, obviously, are all the surrounding influencer media, even the league media, right? The leagues were able to move to an online format quickly. The Call of Duty League playoffs are happening right now, and they're all happening online. Again, it's not a perfect environment. Ideally, you'd want to have everybody in a location on a LAN setting, not playing over the internet, but it's possible. So it can continue on, which I think is important. And I think it shows, one, that there's still a tremendous amount of consumer demand for esports and esports content, and two, that it's adaptable. And that as an industry, we have to remain innovative, not just in a normal environment, but we have to be able to innovate in crazy environments too. So I think that's continued on. Clearly, participation in esports related games has grown substantially, way above anyone's expectations. I think consumption of esports media has skyrocketed as well. So if you kind of look at content on Twitch and YouTube, you just see tremendously more engagement than you would have otherwise. And also, while it's not as core to the esports world, we're about to get into the next console cycle, which hasn't happened in a long time. And that's going to happen under a very strange environment, right? Where gaming is an incredibly hot thing because it's it's a content type that people can do from home, and it's a high value for the per spend kind of form of entertainment, and it's continue to do well. But obviously now there's a whole host of other logistical challenges in front of the platforms with the next console cycle. And the retail component of that is really critical too. I think, in many ways, the last part of the overall, traditional gaming ecosystem that needed a physical retail component to it was really the console hardware, right? And accessories, things that you want to be able to touch with. And I don't, who knows how many people are going to be able to go into retail locations in the near future to do that. So I think it creates a lot of logistical problems, but I do think that in general, esports and gaming across the board have been very innovative and adapted quickly. And I think it's a type of industry that we live in, so it's exciting to be here now. Obviously, I hope, like all the rest of us, you and I are sitting here in New York City where it was really bad this spring. We never want to see that happening. So safety first, and I hope all of our politicians and the medical science world get it together and solve this for us. But in the meantime, the industry is adapting really well.
Right. And on that note, since we're talking about, how rapidly, right, in general the industry has grown as well, I do want to field two questions to you. So these are questions from our audience. They're part of our Q&A session. And the first one is from Tasha, and she's asking, and of course, we've heard this question thrown around, right? I'd say a little more so, right, over the last year and a half, 2 years or so. And she's wondering what you think about an economic bubble for esports, right? Is there a bubble? Is it about to burst soon? Because possibly its intrinsic value of the industry has been overestimated, essentially.
Yeah, I think for the past couple of years, people have been talking about an esports bubble. I think it's really been a esports team organization valuation bubble. I don't think it really has stretched into other aspects of the industry. Although I would say there are a lot of startups that were getting what I would consider to be aspirational valuations when they were raising capital. It's tough for entrepreneurs because you want to take the money in less dilution, but that sort of locks you into a structure that's very hard to get out of if the environment doesn't stay that way. So, I do certainly think that as it related to some team organizations and a bunch of early stage startups, there was a valuation bubble. I would say it started to wane a bit with the team organizations before COVID even. I don't know that if it waned at all in early stage valuations, but I would say those are the valuations that are going to hurt the most in an environment like this, because not due to the pandemic specifically, but there's an economic crisis associated with that. And just generally speaking, the entire early stage venture world is going to have a liquidity issue. And a lot of early stage investors are not anxious to go out and put a lot of money to work right now until they have a more stable footing, looking forward into the just sort of macroeconomic forecast. So I think that'll be an issue for the industry. It's hard to see that there's an esports bubble though, because the underlying business is probably going to be 170 plus billion this year, the game publishing world. And that's the industry that drives esports. So from that perspective, I do agree there was, I also chalk up that whole idea of a bubble to a supply and demand issue. There was a lot of capital very interested in esports very quickly and very few places to put the money.
Right. And sort of on the early stage investing note, right? A lot of esports, right, has really depended on those early stage investors to really, really get off the ground, right? And so going forward, if you see that there is going to be this sort of crunch, right, like what does this mean for the industry? And especially what does it mean for a lot of, let's not even look at teams, right, but a lot of like infrastructure building startups, right, that are like really investing in like that are really looking to develop the technology, that are really looking to develop a lot of the means of like production, right? For a lot of say events to happen or broadcasts to happen, et cetera, right? And that really are trying to support the esports world, right? Like, what does it mean for those companies, right? Looking away for teams, and what does that mean for the industry as a whole, kind of moving forward, right? Does that does that make a dent at all?
Yeah, it definitely will. What I would say also is it's a strange industry because it doesn't follow typical kind of early stage tech patterns, where you can have, an entire company be built around what might be like a platform feature, you know what I mean? Like one little tiny point solution of technology. I don't think that is a viable, economic crisis or not. I didn't think that was ever going to be a viable part of the ecosystem for esports, because you can't forget this entire industry is revolving around the content. The content is IP. It's owned by a relatively small number of very big companies who are the publishers of video games. And those big companies generally have a hard time working with lots of small companies. They would prefer to sort of partner with big enterprise level companies. So what you're describing was kind of the thesis for Vindex, which was how can we roll up a lot of these different pieces of the ecosystem puzzle, put it into one enterprise class business that solves a lot of problems all at once, is well capitalized and professionally managed. And so that was kind of the thesis behind this. COVID and the ensuing economic crisis are certainly going to accelerate that. And we've seen that already
Right.
in our solutions business. Big publishers now wanting to invest longer term and make a safer bet with bigger partners. And so that's definitely playing out. I'm definitely getting calls from startups that had, just 6 months ago, very, very high expectations in terms of valuation and their ability to continue to operate as an independent technology business with, a small revenue base. And I think that that's unrealistic now for a lot of them.
Right.
But look, I'm older than most of the people in esports, as you know, so I've lived through a few economic crises, including the original, 2000 .com bubble. Things happen. Business and economics go through cycles, and it impacts every stage of business. It tends to impact early stage quickly because on the ramp up, everybody wants gigantic valuations and lots of capital, and then inevitably things change and lots of people get caught. There's a famous Warren Buffett, quote about, I don't remember it exactly. You might know, you're a CNBC producer, this quote, but Warren Buffett's thing about seeing who's naked when the tide goes out. That's kind of where you get caught as an early stage startup with a high valuation and lots of need to burn capital to get to any level of proof. And so I think we'll see that happen in the industry. We'll see some earlier stage companies that might have had great innovative technologies unfortunately go away because they can't get access to more capital. My hope is companies like Vindex can kind of take up a lot of that by supporting those companies, not an independent investor or a minority investor in an independent business, but rolling them into a bigger enterprise.
Right. Excuse the coughing, by the way. No, it's a really awkward time to listen to someone cough. But so we have one more question for you.
Sure.
One of the viewers would like to ask you, and I think it's a super good question, one that's not touched on too much. They're wondering, what impact over the next 5 to 10 years do you see the industry from global governing organizations such as the Global Esports Federation, IESF, and other big global esports organizations?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I've always been a big proponent of using, and in some cases copying the kind of ecosystem components of traditional sports media in esports, the business models, the way leagues are structured, things like that. I think two of the areas that I'm not sure how they play a role in esports, primarily because the sport itself, right, the games are IP, they're not public domain. So like, basketball, baseball, soccer are public domain. Anybody can start a league in those sports. You can't start a Call of Duty league without getting permission from Activision, or League of Legends without getting permission from Riot. So in many ways, some of those structures, both the scholastic and the sort of quasi-governmental federations that are being built in the esports world that kind of mirror how that works in the traditional sports world, are in a way sort of having trouble getting footing because they can't control the game, right? And so a lot of what happens in the esports world is you need the publisher's permission to do anything with their games. If they don't want to cede any control of their leagues or their games to an IESF or other organizations like that, it's hard for me to understand how they play a big role. Where I think they can be very valuable is helping with two critical things. So general population education, so being a proponent and educator to the populace of the world or whatever regions they operate in about what sports is, spreading positive message about esports, effectively being sort of an industry lobby in a way. And then the second, I think, is with the government regulatory environment. So explaining to different government regulatory bodies around the world kind of what esports is, how they should interact with the industry. I think there's a really important role that those type of federations can play there, because inevitably as esports gets bigger and better understood, it will start to get regulated, and it'll get regulated differently in different by different governments in different parts of the world. I was actually on a call a couple of weeks ago with the World Economic Forum and some regulators from a few Asian countries, including India. And, they were having discussions over whether it would be the people that regulate television and film or the people that regulate sports or the people that regulate the internet. Like, who's going to regulate this? and what are we even regulating? And so government agencies have a lot of questions, and I think those federations can do a lot to help that part of the process.
Perfect. And with that, we're at time, unfortunately. Mike, thank you so, so much for joining us today here on ESI. And for the rest of you guys, hang tight. More from ESI Digital. Have a nice day.
Thanks, ESI. See ya.